Well, hi, everybody. I'm Kevin Rudd. I'm president of the Asia Society. Welcome to our series of conversations on Asian Americans building America. These are folks who have made an impact right across the country in different ways, from different backgrounds. Today, we're joined by a physician who works with underserved Chinese and Asian American communities with a focus on mental health. Her name is Connie Chen. She's a second-generation Asian American who has lived in Alabama, in Georgia, in New York. You get around a lot, Connie. In China, and is now based in San Mateo in California. So, Connie, you're a second-generation Asian American. What's been your experience living on both coasts of the US and in the South as an Asian American? Tell me what it's been like.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, very different places. Having grown up in the South, there are actually more Asians than you would think. There was, a small community of Chinese Americans like myself and like my family there. And now living on the West Coast in San Mateo and having lived in New York, there are larger Asian communities here too. And interestingly, there's maybe a stereotype about the South that there's more racism, more discrimination against minority communities. But as we've seen in the past year, it can happen even in New York City or in the Bay Area. Yeah.
So you were, I think your folks came out from China in 1989, is that right? Around the time of Tiananmen, is that right?
Yes, my folks came over in the 80s and decided to stay. Yeah.
That's good. So you've been in America now, the family's been in America for just over 30 years. I'm not going to ask your age. I'm told it's impolite to ask those questions. But let's just say you've lived the bulk of your life in the United States, if not all of your life. So tell me, have you experienced racism personally? Either where you are now in San Mateo or elsewhere in the United States, and tell us about those experiences.
Yeah, undoubtedly, on different levels, from, patients asking me before if they could have a doctor who speaks English, even though I speak English fluently and, even better than Chinese, actually, to maybe more on the spectrum of microaggressions, people assuming that I'm from elsewhere when in fact I, consider myself American, Asian American. I haven't had any recent experiences with that, but I know that it's very common. And I've had friends, colleagues before who have said that, someone in the store tells them to go back to their country. And, unfortunately, I've heard even of like colleagues who are doctors having comments from patients before, especially in the past year. So it's been happening and it feels bad. It does. Yeah.
Well, but if you've spent your whole working life in the United States, you've been trained here. And on my experience, you speak fluent English. It must be pretty insulting, frankly, to have a patient say to you, could they possibly see an English-speaking doctor? I mean, given the dialects of English spoken across the United States by white Americans, I find that kind of interesting in itself. So you must find that a bit confronting when you have those sort of encounters.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Taken aback. It's not nice to hear that. At the same time, I'm in a position of relative privilege as a physician. And at times, I've received remarks from people who I know might be struggling with mental illness. I'm a psychiatrist, people who are intoxicated, and, might be disinhibited. And I don't always take it personally, although it has an impact. We're all living in this country and in this world and in this time where unfortunately, there there might be more of this hate speech, permission even, based on all the hate that's out there. And that manifests and comes from a place, I think, of ignorance, and being in this environment where those ideas and sentiments are out there.
So you work in the mental health area. You're a psychiatrist, and psychiatry takes a lot of training time. I'd hate to see your college fees; they must be horrendous. But it's a lot of study involved. Tell me, given your work with the Asian American community and the work that you are doing in the area of mental health, do you see an impact of this sort of racism on Asian Americans being reflected in, let's call it, the overall mental health of the community as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm based in San Mateo County, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area, just south of San Francisco. Our population is 33% Asian. Wow. Quite high. Yeah. And, from Asian therapists and psychiatrists that I've spoken to, everyone's really busy and having a lot of referrals and patients coming in, which I think is actually really wonderful, because in the Asian American community, there can often be a lot of stigma around seeking mental health care. And we, in the Asian American community, among minority communities, seek mental health services at the lowest rate and also have some of the highest rates of suicide. So I think out of all of this struggle and difficulty over the past year, which is absolutely, I think, affecting the community, I'm glad that there's a conversation about seeking help for it.
It's a really interesting point that you make, because I know enough about China and Chinese communities around the world, including in China itself, to know that there is still a stigma attached to seeking professional mental health help. And so if you're beginning to break down those barriers, to me, it would suggest that actually the incidence and intensity of mental health challenges is growing. And particularly off the back of what we've seen through racism in the community over the last, not just year or so, but over an extended period of time. And so people are now ringing the bell and saying we need help. Those figures you just mentioned about the suicide rate among Asian Americans, I was unaware of that. I didn't realize it had been that high. Is that specific to San Mateo? Is it specific to California, or is it a more general stat that you're referring to then?
In the United States, in particular amongst older adult Asian women, and also people who are from, I believe it's the countries of China, Japan, India, and South Korea, those populations in the United States have higher rates of suicide. Yeah.
That's distressing.
It is.
So tell me, you've been in the country a long time. In your own words, what does it feel like? What does it mean to you to be an American? And what does it mean to you to be an Asian American? Give me a sense of what it feels like in your own, and pardon me for saying this to a psychiatrist, but in your own headspace. Tell me what it feels like. And what is your own sense of being an American and an Asian American in 2021?
Yeah. I think Asian American identity is an interesting one. I come from a Chinese background, and, maybe there's a question of whether I identify as Chinese or Asian American, but in the past year, I think it's really given me opportunity to reflect on why I identify as Asian American. As we've seen racist and hateful incidents a lot of them during COVID-19 were kind of targeting all sorts of Asian people from different backgrounds with the idea that they were all Chinese and bringing the Kung flu or the Chinese virus. And no matter whether we identified as, Korean American or Burmese American or Chinese American, we were affected all the same. And that was really powerful and, terrible to have that kind of erasure of our individuality and the huge diversity within the category of Asian American. But also, there's a togetherness and a solidarity that we're all kind of in it together. And I think as far as identifying as an American, thinking out loud, I think that idea of togetherness and solidarity and connecting with others who come from a different background is very much a part of it. For me, I can identify with other folks who might have an immigration history, and we all have, a history of immigration or marginalization at some point in our history and our ancestry. And I think that, that connecting with others in the US who have that same experience is part of what it means to be an American for me.
Yeah, I mean, the melting pot is not just a nice phrase, it's actually the reality over time. Last question to you is, let me put it in these terms. Looking at the future, what gives you hope about the future of, let's call it the melting pot, the role of Asian Americans? We've talked about some of the downsides in terms of the racism that you've experienced. What's your source of hope for the future based on your experiences in the community across the board?
I'm hopeful that I think there's a sense of connecting with each other. Like I mentioned, coming together as Asian Americans and not just Asians from respective, more specific communities. We're all affected by this and in it together. And I'm pretty optimistic about that. And it can be so healing to be with other Asian Americans and to not feel so alone because we're all affected by what's happening.
What's an encouraging message? Particularly in the face of the assaults that you referred to before, like politically intended messaging, like the Kung flu. That sort of stuff is out there, used deliberately politically to foment a reaction. And it did, and it was hurtful. Leaving aside the whole question of the origins of COVID-19 virus from Wuhan, the fact that you had a bunch of folks trying to stigmatize an entire group of people in the country who may not have been back to China in 30 years, that they are somehow responsible. Frankly, for me, as an outsider, I'm an Australian, I just think it stinks. The last tip from you, because you're a psychiatrist, one sentence in terms of advice to anyone watching this YouTube presentation from us on seeking assistance around mental health. If someone's experiencing those challenges, they're on the receiving end of racist barbs in their community, and it's impacting their own mental health badly, what should they do?
I recommend not suffering alone and reaching out to someone else, someone you trust, whether it's a family member or a teacher or a colleague, and not struggling alone. In addition, there are resources out there. There's the crisis hotline, the National Crisis Hotline, which is 1-800-273-8255. There are also resources out there for Asian folks and non-Asian folks to support each other during this time. Asian Americans Advancing Justice has an excellent bystander intervention training. If you see someone getting harassed or treated badly in the community, you can speak up if you don't want to intervene right there, you can go up to them afterwards and see if you can, buy them a bottle of water or escort them to a place where they feel safer. Just that contact, not being so alone, but having someone there can mean so much to someone who's the target of an attack or who's struggling.
Well, that's great advice, including not just to Asian Americans, but to any American who witnesses and sees a racism happening before their very eyes. There's no such thing as the innocent bystander. We've all got a moral responsibility to act at that point and to support the person who's on the receiving end of vile racist attacks. Dr. Connie Chen, thanks so much for being with us today. We really appreciate you and all that you've been doing for the Bay Area community as a health professional focused on mental health. I'm Kevin Rudd. I'm from the Asia Society. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.